Great. Well, thank you for that introduction, Kathy, and thank you everyone for joining the session today and the training in general. So as Kathy said, I'm Trey Miller, and I have been at AIR for 3.5 years and just moved to Dallas, so enjoying the Texas heat today. I'm going to talk today about just introduction to causal research with CTE lens generally, as kind of a way to get into some of the topics and introduce some of the topics that we'll get into in more detail in later segments of the training. Causal research in education, which is being supported by a number of funders, including, but not limited to, the U.S. Department of Education, Institute of Education Sciences, has been on a huge rise in recent decades. And the goal of causal research is to provide evidence of the effectiveness of a program, intervention, or policy change on one or more desired outcomes. So if we're interested in evaluating how well a new program affects some outcome, we can measure that outcome for those who were in the program, but we also want to be able to say something about what the outcomes would have occurred had they not been in the program. So that's called the counterfactual. And you'll hear this, coming back in kind of all the sessions. So the difference between outcomes for those having received the treatment compared to the counterfactual would indicate the causal impact of treatment on the outcome. The problem is, and this is, some say, the fundamental problem of evaluation, is we can't directly measure what would have happened to the same set of people under different circumstances. So education evaluation study designs generally compare the outcomes of students who are exposed to an intervention with those who aren't, because that's what we can actually observe. So if we're interested in evaluating how well a new program affects some outcome, we can measure that outcome for those who are in the program. But again, we want to be able to say what would have happened had he or she not been in the program, the counterfactual. So the differences between outcomes for having received treatment compared to the counterfactual would indicate the causal impact. But since we can't measure it, that's the fundamental issue. So well-designed causal studies provide a credible simulation of this counterfactual with an unbiased comparison group. And that's really what the focus of causal research is, find methods that replicate a valid counterfactual. So just as an example, think about an intense mentoring program for students at risk of not graduating from high school. And you might think about just comparing the graduation rates for students in the mentoring program to those not in the mentoring program, and see that it's 85% for those in and 75% for those not in the program. And you might think that this might be some evidence of effectiveness. What problems might you see with that? How confident are you in the difference in graduation rates being due to that mentoring program? Any thoughts from the group?
Not at all. Mainly, this is something we see in SLDS research a lot, because I have no idea if there are GPA differences. I have no idea if there's demographic differences. There are so many other underlying effects that might actually be what's causing the graduation rate increase that it's impossible to know.
Very, very good. And yeah, I agree with you. And this is a particular case, participating in a mentoring program could be, due to a number of factors, like some of which you raised, but, teacher flag students to participate in the mentoring program because they're in need of it. That might bias you downwards. Or it could be, students are really motivated to participate in a mentoring program, and that, they would do well regardless of the program. So these are some things that would go wrong with that. So, this kind of comparison of outcomes for treatment and control condition is really only good as to the extent you believe that the comparison group is representative of the counterfactual. And this is a case where we really shouldn't. So, you know, there's a number of things that we look at in terms of validity for causal research designs and statistical approaches. You know, conclusions about impact must consider 4 types of validity that are outlined in Campbell, and which you're likely familiar. So, for example, internal validity is the validity of the inference about whether changes in treatment condition impacts changes in the outcome. So a threat to internal validity is something other than the treatment that explains the variation in the measured outcome. And so then, you know, confounds the intended causal inference. That's what we were talking about with the mentoring program example just a minute ago. Statistical conclusion validity is, whether the statistical methods were, you had enough power, for example, to see the difference in outcomes in a rigorous way, or whether or not you violated some assumptions that were necessary for the method to yield causal effects. Construct validity refers to how well the inferences made about higher level constructs represented in the study match what was actually represented and what was actually implemented, and what was actually measured as an outcome. So for example, when presenting findings about the impact of mentoring, does the discussion and implications match the reality of what kind of mentoring was done in the study? Oftentimes, studies aren't able to measure that well. External validity then refers to the generalizability of findings or the validity of inferences about whether a cause and effect relationships hold under variation in persons, settings, treatment variables, and measurement variables. Is there a question from someone? Okay. So threats, there's a number of threats to internal validity that we have to grapple with in all of these causal research methods. So first is selection. This is really fundamental. It's a threat when the observed outcome might be caused by systematic differences in the kinds of students in the treatment and comparison groups. So the difference in outcomes between groups caused by the treatment, or at least partially explained by differences in the students, or something, you know, that that cause them to be different a priori. So higher graduations for the treated group may result from beneficial characteristics like likelihood of graduation, motivation, interest, higher economic advantage, or involved parents. Attrition is a threat when an observed effect might be caused by a systematic differential dropout between the treatment and the control groups. So students who are struggling to drop out of the comparison group at a higher rate than the treatment group, then the comparisons of outcomes between treatment and comparison groups will be biased, even if the two groups were similar at the start of the study. And then history is a threat when an observed effect might be caused by an unexpected influential event taking place during the study period. So if graduation rates increase from before and after the study period for students in schools with the new mentoring program compared with the rates during the time for students in schools without the program, you would want to be sure that the treated schools did not have some other beneficial event, policy change or program that positively impact the outcome. So maturation is a threat when an observed effect might be caused by subjects getting older, wiser, or more experienced in the course of the study. So any improvement on a measure from before and after might be caused by this maturation rather than the treatment. Testing is a threat when an observed effect might be caused by subjects doing better on an outcome test simply because they have experience of taking the test as a pretest before treatment. And then regression is this idea of regression to the mean. Because of measurement error, extreme scores tend to be less extreme when measured a second time. So if inclusion into the study is based on very low scores on some measure, and that measure is observed over time, then you'd expect that the outcome scores will get less extreme regardless of the program intervention because of regression to the mean. And then finally, instrumentation is a threat when the observed effect might be caused by some difference between the treatment and comparison groups and how the outcome is measured. So I just wanted to stop and pause. I went over a lot there on internal validity issues and wanted to see if I had any questions that came up. Some of that may be review, it may not be for you, but it's a good opportunity to chat. And I can go to the, is anything coming up in the chat box? Let me know, Kathy. No? Okay. Then I won't go to the chat box. I will assume everyone knows all about internal validity. We go over a number of different research, starting with kind of non-experimental designs that aren't intended even to be causal, and talk about some issues with them and things specifically to think about. So a pre-post design compares the performance of a group of individuals before and after exposure. So the internal validity threat of selection is not a problem with these pre-post studies because a comparison group is the same set of students as a treatment group, but there's no guard against a lot of the other internal validity threats like history, maturation, or testing. And there's no way to know if the improvement is caused by the treatment. You just see the outcome go up. It may be because students test better the second time, as an example. Correlational designs, look at the relationship between two variables. So for example, we can see that students who have more frequent visits to their school counselor in the first 2 years of high school end up taking more advanced math courses by the end of grade 12. The positive relationship between counselor visits and advanced coursework is not really evidence of a causal relationship, though, because we don't know if more counselor visits led to the higher enrollment in higher level math courses. There's no guards against internal validity threats. So you can probably think of some explanations for why that would be the case. Any thoughts?
Yeah, maybe the students who had already intended to take more advanced courses are more likely to go to visit the counselor in the first place.
Right. That's an example. Yeah, students that want to go to college and know that they have to take advanced math courses, they go visit their counselor. So you don't want to attribute the counseling itself to, or the benefit to the counseling itself. Any other thoughts?
We also have the parental influence. So certain parents might definitely encourage kids to take more math courses and may also encourage those students to visit the counselor.
Yep. Good, very good point. So these are all things that we think would probably cause upward bias in that relationship, because the parental involvement, the kind of motivation to take more advanced courses are things that we think are correlated with doing well generally. And so if you make the comparison, you would expect the mean, outcomes for those that visited the counselor more frequently to be higher than other groups. So, you may include other important factors in an analysis, correlational analysis, such as, middle school coursework, grades, demographic characteristics, participation in other school activities, parent expectancy, and a regression framework to examine the influence of counselor visits beyond the influence of other factors that are observable on course enrollment. It's possible to control for a lot of these things often, and provide interesting, but usually not something that we think of as causal findings, except in extreme circumstances. So these kinds of designs are often the only option when using existing available data, and they can be inexpensive compared with collecting new data and are appropriate for exploratory studies. Well-done correlational studies are valuable and provide promising information that may advance understanding of how factors are interrelated and suggest the direction of a new study with a stronger design to examine causality. So descriptive studies, I don't want to discount the value of descriptive or correlational studies, and the value of a well-done descriptive study, shouldn't be overlooked. So research that clearly describes the features, variations, and trends about an education topic can be critical, to building understanding, detecting, creating hypotheses, or contributing to the design or interpretation of a causal study. Experimental studies or randomized control trials are studies that aim to answer research questions about causality directly. They have individuals, groups of individuals or institutions randomly assigned to receive a treatment or intervention, whereas others are assigned a comparison condition that might be status quo or business as usual. So RCTs are experiments and are considered the gold standard in evaluation because the random assignment ensures that the treated and untreated groups are similar on both observable and unobservable characteristics, with treatment being the only systematic difference between them. So randomization just equates the groups on expectations for all observed and unobserved variables. They're the best designed to control for alternative explanations of differences between treatment and comparison groups. And then in a well-done RCT with large enough sample size and low attrition, the difference in outcomes between treatment and control can confidently be attributed to treatment. So a well-designed RCT can provide really strong evidence of the impact of an intervention or program on measured outcomes. And so I'll be tomorrow talking more about RCTs, and I think I have about a 45-minute to an hour presentation tomorrow on that. So we'll have more on that later. One of the big drawbacks about RCTs is that they're really expensive and difficult to implement, and they often take a long time to provide the evidence that's needed. Now, quasi-experimental designs, there's a number of quasi-experimental designs that we'll talk about and go into depth in later sessions, and I'll touch on them here, but quasi-experimental designs are often used when random assignment's not feasible. So similar to RCTs, participants receiving treatment are compared with those not receiving treatment, and all quasi-experimental designs are designed to ensure that the treatment and comparison groups are equivalent, but the equivalence can be verified on only observed measured variables. Because assignment into groups is not random, there's no way to ensure that groups are similar on important unobserved or unmeasured characteristics such as motivation or interest. If there is a systematic difference in important unobserved characteristics, importance means a characteristic that might be related to the outcomes regardless of treatment, then a difference seen in the outcomes between treated and comparison groups could be caused by the difference in that unobserved variable rather than the treatment they're trying to study. Quasi-experimental designs are designed to reduce the possibility that there may be important pre-existing or contextual differences between treatment and comparison groups. And when well done, they can offer evidence of causal relationship, but the evidence is generally not thought of as strong as it is from an RCT. So now I'm going to go into just touch on several different QED approaches that will go into more detail in later sessions. So regression discontinuity, or RD, is a rigorous quasi-experimental design method for estimating intervention impacts in situations in which students or schools receive an intervention because they scored above or below a cut point on some measure. Those who do or do not receive treatment and score near the cut score can be compared on outcomes while controlling for difference on the qualifying measure. So again, we'll have a full presentation on this later. Comparative interrupted time series is considered also considered a strong quasi-experimental design where treatment and comparison groups are measured across time, and program impacts are evaluated by looking at whether the treatment group deviates from its baseline trend after the intervention differently than the comparison group does. So is there greater growth in outcomes in the group that's treated than in the group that's not? Again, we'll have a session on this method later in the training as well. So matched comparison group designs include a treatment and comparison that have been designed to be similar on important characteristics. There's multiple ways to use data to inform group assignment, and researchers may use propensity score methods to create a comparison group, matching intervention and comparison use on characteristics that are likely to be related to the outcome of interest. This is considered a less rigorous quasi-experimental design than RD, or comparative interrupted time series. You know, a key assumption that is required for matched comparison groups is that, again, you can control for and match students on all things that are systematically different between them and likely related to the outcome. It relies on selection on observables, which, just like with OLS regressions or correlational type studies, is likely to be unmet. There's some cases where that is where it is true, but where it can be met, but they're few and far between. So I went over a lot of methods, a lot of approaches. I wanted to stop and see if anyone had any questions or would like to discuss before we move on.
I guess I'm curious. I'm not sure if this fits in here or somewhere else a little better, but it's something that I run into a little bit in my own research here at the state. So in these quasi-experimental designs, what do you do with choice if a student has chosen to participate? I've never come up with a great way to disentangle that.
Yeah, so a lot of really perfectly valid quasi-experimental designs rely on a sample of students opting in or wanting to participate, like a lottery-based study. So you have a set of students, all of whom want to participate in a CTE program, right? And half of the students win a lottery and get in, and half of them don't. So that makes valid comparisons amongst the group that opted in and wanted to do it. But it's an issue with external validity. So your results are only relevant for the types of students who would want to participate, and to the extent that they go in and go through the lottery process, right, which is a very select subgroup. And so you have to think about that context when interpreting results from studies.
Right. So in a case where there wasn't a lottery system, you just had some students that chose to do something and a bunch of students that didn't, and you were trying to compare them.
So that's an even bigger issue, I think, and an important issue. So that's one where that student choice, you have to think about what would be driving that student choice, what types of factors would be driving that choice, in trying to choose control variables that can address those forms of selection. So like if you think students who are better academically prepared might be likely to choose this particular model, then you'd want to try to find a test score to control for. The problem is, in that context, you're never going to be able to control for every source of selection between students that choose to participate and those that don't. And, you know, so that's, again, when you get into that kind of context, you're really searching, if you want to do causal analysis, you're really searching for contexts where things are implemented in ways where they may be based only on students that select into a program, but there is some form of credible either random assignment effectively through either lotteries or in our regression discontinuity design where students barely score above or below a cut score, or you know, kind of context where you can reconstruct, you know, you can control for baseline characteristics with a comparative interrupted time series. So it's a fundamental challenge in research, and I don't want to discount, you know, the value again of the correlational studies that look at, you know, outcomes of students that choose to participate versus don't, controlling for some factors or not. They can be very illustrative and help identify where we might want to do more rigorous causal studies, you know, to see whether that pattern really holds up to more rigorous, well, I don't want to say rigorous, we always say rigorous, but causal analysis, right? I think correlational studies and, you know, descriptive studies are very rigorous. They're just not designed to answer that question. Is it causing the result? So, any other questions? Nothing coming up in the chat box, Kathy? I'm not hearing you, Kathy. You got to unmute.
Sorry. Just a comment from Jeff Fletcher saying test, retest, test, retest, test again. What do you mean by that, Fletch?
I was on mute, sorry. I just meant that I think about the work we do at Iowa State, or I mean Department of Ed, and you test a sample, you're gonna retest again. I mean, in terms of the scientific method, you know, it's never, the work never ends. So that's essentially, I was just making a comment.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, and you know, that's another important point, is particularly in context. You know, one of the fundamental challenges with causal research, and the most difficult thing we often do, is we tend to sacrifice sometimes external validity for internal validity. So we know that we're getting the causal effect for a certain group, but it may not extrapolate to all groups. So you don't just want to do one lottery-based assignment study and call it a day, because the results you get in that one lottery-based study are unique to that one particular context, and the counterfactual, like the types of programs that were the status quo if students didn't win the lottery in the particular place where there was a lottery, et cetera. So, you know, test and retest is particularly important, I think, in the causal analysis realm, because in order to establish some semblance of external validity, you really need to do it multiple times in different contexts, right? So, any other questions or thoughts? Okay, well, I will move on. So, there's some aspects that are common across all of these types of quasi-experimental designs in terms of what you really need to do and to ensure it's a high quality study, and like your assumptions are being met to think of the results as causal. So one, you know, it's important for a quasi-experimental design study to have a treatment and comparison group to see what would have happened without the treatment or intervention. The groups have to be distinct, not the same students measured before and after treatment as with pre-post designs. Group formation can be accomplished through various non-random processes. Groups could be created largely for convenience, for instance, choosing comparison group schools that are near your intervention schools, or by comparing schools that volunteer to implement a new curriculum that did not. Baseline equivalence is really key. So the reason for establishing baseline equivalence is that intervention and comparison groups are different at the start of the study. Those differences could be carried through to the outcomes and be mistaken for an effect of the intervention. So this is, you know, the internal validity we've been talking about, a missing variable problem. So if the intervention group scores are substantially higher than the comparison group scores on the pretest, and the intervention group also has a higher test score than the comparison group on the post-test, it's impossible to know whether the high pretest scores are the result of the intervention or the pre-existing differences between those groups, as an example. It's necessary to demonstrate that the groups were similar prior to the intervention or at baseline on key characteristics that are likely to be correlated with outcomes. So when groups are similar on observed characteristics such as age and test score prior to the intervention, we can be more confident that any observed effect was caused by that intervention. So you need to really, in all of these methods, collect relevant pretest data whenever you possibly can, and ensure that there's baseline equivalence. So free of confounding factors. So you also want to make sure that there's no component or factor of the study that may influence the outcome and is aligned with only one study condition for a group. So if a factor is present in one condition but not in the other, it's impossible to separate the effect of the intervention from the effect of the confounding factor. So a common confound is that there's only one unit in one or both conditions, such as if a new mentoring program is implemented in a high school and academic outcomes are compared with a nearby high school that did not have the program. So in that case, you can't isolate the effect of the intervention because the intervention school and comparison schools may differ in ways that are related to those academic outcomes. So to decrease the likelihood that some factors confound the results, both the intervention and comparison groups must contain at least 2 units or schools in this example. The third, you also have to have an appropriate outcome measure. Outcomes are used to estimate the impact of the treatment, and test, observation protocols, or other instruments to assess outcomes in RCTs and quasi-experimental designs need to have strong measurement properties. There should be evidence of the validity of the instrument to measure the construct of interest, and it should have sufficient reliability to ensure that it measures concepts consistently across time and people. So as an example, an outcome can't be over-aligned with the intervention. When outcome measures are closely aligned with or tailored to the intervention, they can give an advantage to the intervention group. So as an example from some of my own research, co-requisite remediation is a strategy where students in developmental education and post-secondary education who are not deemed not college ready, they test below college ready, receive remediation concurrently with being enrolled in their college level course, right? And an outcome that people tend to look at is whether or not students pass a first college level course. Well, that is arguably an over-aligned outcome, right? Because the intervention, being enrolled concurrently in a college level course and a remediation, places you in that college level course directly, so gives you a chance to pass the college level course. So it's, in some sense, some would say that looking at just that outcome, that's kind of baked into the treatment. So you would want to, in that case, look at longer term outcomes like passing follow-on courses and persistence and completion, right? So again, a lot of stuff we covered. I wanted to stop and pause and see if anyone had any questions or want to discuss. Let me see what time it is.
It can be hard sometimes when you're looking at data to get those baseline equivalencies, right? Because if you're, for instance, just a third-party evaluator and you're coming in, you may not necessarily have access to data beforehand. So are there any good strategies or good practices on what to do if that's not available?
That's a very good, great point. First, I'd say, you know, do whatever, you do the best you can and do whatever you can to see if there's some way to get those baseline variables if you can. And sometimes, in some cases, that means thinking about, you know, maybe you want to start with a correlation, a more correlational study this year and look at, you know, outcomes comparisons controlling for a set of characteristics you have, while at the same time implementing a process to start collecting baseline data from your current cohorts so that then next year you could, you know, do a more rigorous study. That gives you some evidence to draw on early to think about that then you can test, see if it, you know, and more causally later with, and have more confidence in the results. So that's one thing. And then the other thing is something we'll talk about in a minute. I am a huge proponent of, you know, qualitative and mixed methods research. And so really understanding what, you know, is going on in practice through interviews and focus groups and surveys, other types of methods where you can collect that data concurrently and can really provide context to what may be more correlational or descriptive findings to give you some confidence or a greater degree of confidence that the differences in outcomes you're seeing may be due to, you know, the program versus something else you learn about through the qualitative data collection. So that's another thing. If you're starting work currently without having a lot of good baseline equivalence data, you can supplement it with good qualitative data to give you more confidence in the differences in outcomes.
Trey, there's a question in the chat box asking for another example of an over-aligned outcome measure.
Yeah, so let me think. I have an example in my notes here. Okay, yeah, here's an example. You know, an outcome derived from reviewing specific reading passages. It was used as part of the intervention, but not in the status quo. So if you're evaluating a reading intervention and your outcome that you're looking at is, you know, something that's covered, testing content that's only covered in your intervention and not the other, then you would expect to see a better outcome with that group. So, yeah.
How about, I'm just thinking of the National Academy Foundation program. So say if you had students randomly assigned to a health program, you know, a health occupations program, and the other students weren't, and then you were measuring their knowledge of the health occupations.
Yeah.
Would that be an example as well, Trey?
Yeah, I mean, I think so. I mean, it's really more, so you are measuring the increase in content knowledge around health professions,
yeah,
right?
You want them to learn that.
That's important to understand. Where it gets really over-aligned, thinking about over-alignment, is in measures that are like, did you know, an outcome is, did you receive this content, right? Did you do you have recall of something about health professions? So you know, there's kind of a gray area. Some of the things are important to really get at, to understand what's going on, but you don't really want to think of these over-aligned outcome measures as the actual impact. I think they're still important to look at, but you don't want to think of it as like the causal impact of the study or of the intervention, right? So.
Okay. And another question is, how do you typically identify the comparison group in the CITS design?
So the comparison group in the comparative interrupted time series is a group of students or schools that did not receive treatment, but you observe them pre and post. So the idea is you compare the gains, pre-post gains for the group that receives treatment to the group that does not receive treatment. Does that make sense?
Can you relate that to difference in differences?
It's basically the same thing. I'm an economist by training, and I think of whenever anyone says comparative interrupted time series, I naturally think difference in difference. It's a difference on difference model. Sometimes in education, you know, we'll do things with random effects and fixed effects. So there's, you know, different kind of hierarchical models. And so I think the language that has developed around it just is not coming from the economics field. So.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Great. And Scott points out that we'll be going into more depth on comparative interrupted time series designs on Thursday.
Yep.
Okay.
Any other questions? Let's see what time it is.
We are getting to the end of our time.
We are. So I will move on and go kind of quickly. Just quickly, the What Works Clearinghouse is U.S. Department of Education's IES's initiative. What Works Clearinghouse is a central and trusted source of scientific evidence for what works in education. And they examine research about interventions that focus on proving educational relevant outcomes, including those for students and educators. So there's a rigorous review process. There's a big repository of studies that have gone through What Works Clearinghouse review, and there's two levels of credibility and quality that What Works Clearinghouse focuses on explicitly and that's with and without reservations. So this group rating, that's without reservations. The study's got to be an RCT and have low attrition. And then to qualify for what with reservations, it has to it can be a higher attrition RCT and have comparison groups that appear to be similar at baseline. So a quasi-experimental design or high attrition RCT that doesn't satisfy without reservations can meet with reservations. So the goal of this training is to prepare you to conduct studies that meet What Works Clearinghouse standards with or without reservations. And the sessions later in the training about RCTs and RD and comparative interrupted time series will go into details about how to meet these What Works Clearinghouse guidelines in those specific contexts. So as I said, implementation research is also really important. So far we've highlighted how different research designs relate to the ability to draw conclusions about the effectiveness of an intervention. But when evaluating a program, verifying the program was delivered according to plans is really critical. And identifying key elements of the intervention and measuring the degree to which those elements occurred during the study period provides evidence of the fidelity of implementation. So if intervention was not implemented as it was designed or intended to be used, the conclusion of the effectiveness of the study was, and the study won't be valid. And a study that finds is ineffective should be able to provide evidence that the program was implemented according to the intended model. Otherwise, it's impossible to tell if an effect or lack of an effect is related to the intervention. So implementation research is broad and goes beyond this notion of fidelity, though, and includes investigation of what happens when a program or intervention is adopted. So how a program is developed and implemented locally, what elements are actually enacted in a real-world setting, why certain context setting and factors influence how the program or policy is implemented. In addition, implementation research examines how different conclusions or context are related to how the program, how effective the program is for improving student outcomes. And then most of our training this week is focused on quantitative research for conducting causal studies. And again, I don't want to discount the importance of mixed methods. I've already kind of gone over this. Mixed methods designs incorporate qualitative research like interviews, focus groups, case studies, or observations to provide a richer understanding of how of a program's implementation and effectiveness. Like interviews with key program staff or other stakeholders might provide information to verify fidelity of implementation. Could be done to explore perspectives to help explain the quantitative findings or explore unexpected findings after a quantitative study and generate new hypotheses about what was going on. And we provide some literature about best practices for qualitative research in the bibliography we shared and in the other content we shared for optional reading. And I think that's what I have as far as content and an introduction to causal research methods. See if anyone has other comments or questions or thoughts before we close on.
I was going to say another valuable thing to do with qualitative research is to use it to help identify causal opportunities.
Yeah.
So just like doing these sort of really deep dives with stakeholders, and oftentimes you'll just hear things. You might hear about a lottery, or you might hear about a program rollout that was going to happen anyway that might give rise to an RCT.
Right. And so I'll just point you to, as an example of that, so as part of our CTE Research Network, Kathy and I and my colleague, Kelly Reese, just recently engaged in a national evaluability study, which is for CTE research opportunities, which is a explicitly qualitative approach to identifying opportunities for causal research that can advance the field of CTE. And we provided that study to you as an example, but there's a case where we did qualitative research explicitly with the goal of identifying causal research opportunities.